the structure of this panel is a conversation that I get the opportunity to guide and shape. So I have a series of questions, just kind of provocations that I'd like to kind of put out here for Doug and John, in part because they just finished a new book, and it came out in January, called A New Culture of Learning, Cultivating the Imagination for a World in Constant Change. And I've been watching this book develop. I have spent many days myself kind of in their previous publications, thinking about it, working through their ideas and so on. And I haven't had a chance to have kind of more of a conversation with them. So Jonathan, I want to thank you for hosting this conference so that I could get a chance to talk to these two guys, because it's been about a year and a half I've been trying to get together with them in the same space-time continuum. Yes, no, that's what I'm saying, face-to-face, because, you know, one on asynchronous doesn't get us in conversation as easily. So this book is really interesting. It is a culmination of pieces that I've seen in different, published in different places. And it was at one point going to be something like a 300-page book, and it has been distilled to some incredibly kind of interesting and very kind of laser-sharp ideas in about a 118-page book. So what I'd like to do is get them to kind of get into that book, talk a little bit about this, and kind of start us off with just what the project is. So the title of the book, A New Culture of Learning. So I've got to ask the question, what do you mean by a culture of learning? And then, of course, why do we need a new culture of learning? So can I?
Sure.
You're good. Okay.
I must say, I like having a wire attached to my mic. Roger Dalters spin around. So, you know, that term was a really important one to us, and it didn't start off that way, but the deeper we got into thinking about this book and this project, the more we started playing with the very idea of culture. And it started off in the kind of straight anthropological sense, which is you know, building off of some of the work that Mimi Ito was doing, where she was actually looking at what people were doing with technology and trying to figure out what cultures were emerging around digital technology, particularly among youth. So this is all very interesting to us and fit very well with our project. And then we came upon some other work, and it started to suggest that we might have to think about culture in a second sense. And that second sense of culture is the way you think of a culture in a petri dish. And that struck us as a metaphor that had a lot of power. And the sense of that petri dish has two interesting properties. The first is that it's absolutely bounded. It is a glass container that has substrate or a medium in it for things to grow. But in order for a petri dish to work and for you to trust the results, you have to let whatever happens inside the dish evolve on its own. So you have this combination of a bounded environment with almost unlimited kind of potential for growth inside that environment. And we thought, if we could have classrooms that started to look like that, that could be a really powerful concept. And a lot of this, too, was in response to this sort of utopian notion that everything's out on the internet, and we just let kids loose on Wikipedia and on Google, that they'll learn everything they need to know. And we thought that wasn't quite right either. But the idea of having that resource that you could pour into that petri dish and then watch what happens, that struck us as a really important concept. So partly what you get then is some shifting of roles. And the idea of a new culture of learning was particularly important to us, because we thought what we have today in the classroom is really a culture of teaching. Right? Is that we are assuming that the way education works is that somebody stands up who knows more and tells people who know less things, and then we measure what percentage of that information is transferred. You know, if it's 70%, we give them a C and on up. But it doesn't really give us much insight into what learning is. So we thought this metaphor of the petri dish starts to describe a process where learning can be something we kind of tackle head on, and that's really what the book became about, I think. I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I just add two things to that. In a world of constant change, the willingness to constantly be experimenting and not expected to be an authority telling you stuff becomes increasingly more important. And so the mechanisms that make a petri dish actually work became, to us, very suggestive of how we should be thinking about connecting the dots in a world in which no one yet quite knows how to connect the dots. But the second thing is, people keep asking, how is this practical? Because after all, if you try to do full inquiry method teaching or learning, as Singapore has discovered, you know, teachers are used to being the authority. But in this kind of scheme of the new culture that we're talking about, basically the kids will be asking question after question after question, which means that the teachers are probably going to constantly be put on stage and say, I don't know. Now, how do you actually turn that into a plus, where now the teachers and the kids together come together to try to really figure out, you know, what is the answer? How do you navigate this information space to kind of connect the dots to make sense of something? So that was one aspect, and let me just say quickly the second. You see throughout our whole book and many things that you know, Doug has really pioneered, is that we're looking for constant ways to transform constraints into a resource. We keep talking about the petri dish as a bounded environment, or imagination comes from bounds. And you know, I was really struck when I first went to Bilbao to look at Frank Gehry's work. And I went down to see where his museum was. Pardon me. And then the person I was with, an architect, actually two, my wife being an architect, pointed up on the hill, beautiful hillside, across the river, virgin territory. And they said, you know, we offered Frank that space. It was an unbounded space that he would have to do anything he wanted. Well, Frank would do. He said, no. I want to be down here at this bridge, the most constrained environment you can believe. And that actually, I think, stimulated him to take those constraints into fantastic resources to build something that we've never seen. So I mean, I think there's something about this whole sense of how do you honor the constraint, but how do you use that as a way to stimulate the imagination? We wanted to also be able to pull out through this new culture.
Let's talk a little bit about this notion of the petri dish as the site or the architecture for the spaces of learning, because what I hear and where my mind goes when you think about that is that as a teacher who wants to now be inspired by this metaphor, I would, to do my own shift in thinking from teaching to learning, that what my responsibility would be in architecting the petri dish, right? That I would be the one now, not so much as the single source of authority, but more the architect of where the boundaries are, whether that's a physical space or an intellectual space or a disciplinary domain space or a space defined by questions. These are the key themes of our learning adventure. These are our key questions we will explore here. So I would be an architect of a bounded space. That's a different role for me to play than an authority figure. And I would be, this is the other thing I'm thinking, when the authority lines can come from many channels. Right, we've got Wikipedia, and we've got YouTube, and we've got Twitter feeds now, and we've got kind of mobile apps and so on. We've got our informal groups. Then I'm not the final authority figure, but I am the one who orchestrates understandings about competing claims to authority, perhaps including my own as the teacher. So I'm sure these things come up in the book about talking about what do you say to teachers? What role do they play kind of in this kind of transformed culture of learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point, and I'll make it a little bit personal in the sense that, you know, I'm trying to put a lot of these practices into the classroom, and I think of myself as somebody who's really on board with all of these ideas. I wrote a book about it, right? And I am constantly racked with guilt at the feeling that I'm not teaching enough, you know, and that I'm not doing my job fully, that I'm, every time I give them authority in the classroom or too much power or the ability to explore, I get very nervous because I feel like somehow, that's not what I'm being paid to do. So it's a very strange feeling. And just yesterday, in fact, well, a week before, I'm teaching a class on communication, technology, and culture. And the students were asking what their final paper was going to be like and so on. And one of them said, I think half jokingly, could we write the paper prompt for the final paper? And I said, absolutely. In fact, we'll take half the class next week and we'll do it. And it was really interesting to watch them do that, and really hard for me to sit there and keep my mouth shut while they argued back and forth. And what I found myself doing is that I felt like they were straying a little bit from where they needed to go, I would kind of gently nudge. So I think in one way, the role of the teacher then is to kind of be a guardrail, right? When you see them going off the cliff, right, you nudge them back. Another is to be a mentor and to recognize in those students different dispositions and figure out how you provide the nutrients into the environment to nurture that growth. And one of the examples in the book, we talk about a teacher looking at 3 students playing piano. Right? So the first one plays the scales and bangs it out furiously. And the second one plays it very, very delicately and lightly and crisply. And the third one plays the scale, but they're doing something else too, and it's a little strange. And for us, the teacher says there's a rock pianist, there's a concert pianist, and there's a jazz pianist. And today's teacher says, oh my God, they're all doing it wrong. So the ability to look at each student and find what they need and mentor them in that way, I think fits, again, with that notion of the Petri dish as a kind of set of nutrients to allow growth. And you can't dictate what that growth should look like. You have to let it follow its course. But at the same time, we're still talking about piano. We're still talking about the scales. We're still talking about music. We're still talking about certain things that are important. And exercises, yeah. But now they're having fun doing it, and they're following their passions, right? And that's what the book's about.
But one twist I'd add to that, I'd add 2 twists. One is that Doug yesterday launched a blog site. That's a blogging kind of the experiences he's actually going through himself as he's constantly living these experiments. That I think will really, somehow by doing the book, it kind of authorized you to admit publicly that these experiments were going on.
But yeah, there's a book.
Right. So, it's a great blog. But I think it's another shift is the shift from teaching, you brought up, to cultivating. And that's why the word cultivation is so important. In the title, the subtitle, culture and cultivation. So the real question is, we as leaders and teachers are trying to cultivate imagination in our workforce, in our school force, and so on and so forth, our students. And I think that we have to think pretty seriously what leads to that kind of effective cultivation, which is quite different than the usual push model of teaching. It's obvious at some level, but that word was chosen pretty carefully because I think it is meant to be evocative for all kinds of